This is our fourth and final video regarding our module on religion. Let's start out with our learning objectives for this video. There are two. We're going to look carefully at the geography of religion in the United States, and what we're going to do is we're going to identify a few formal regions. Then, particularly, we're going to look at the geography of Roman Catholicism, Baptists, and Judaism in the United States to kind of round out our discussion. And I suppose just to summarize then what this fourth and final video regarding religion is going to do is we're going to narrow the focus from our global analysis to looking at just the United States as basically a case study. So let's start out with the first map that I have. It's a fairly complicated map. It is a statistical map, and it's got a lot of data behind it. Basically, for every county in the United States, data was collected. And they asked people, hey, what branch of Christianity or perhaps another religion do you identify with? And just about everywhere, Christianity does tend to be the dominant religion in the United States. And so what they then did is asked people about the particular branch of Christianity that they adhere to or practice. And the result is that they looked at the percentage breakdown in every county. And the counties are color-coded by either the majority branch of Christianity or in some cases the plurality. So in other words, what's the dominant or the one group that has the largest number of adherents? Now, I want to at least temporarily ignore all the blue. The blue represents those parts of the United States where the largest group is the Catholic Church. For now, though, I want to ignore the blue, and we will address Roman Catholicism and its geography in actually the subsequent slide. Rather, what I want to do is I want to look carefully at this gray area right through here, this yellow area right through here that is unfortunately a little bit more diffuse, and then finally this very large block of red that you have essentially corresponding to the American South. Let's start out with the gray area. If you look at the legend, the gray area represents those counties in the United States where the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the largest component of the overall population with respect to what religion people identify with. That's basically, of course, the Mormon Church. So there is a formal region because this entire area here is represented by a pretty high degree of religious homogeneity or religious uniformity. And that formal region we're going to call basically the Mormon religious formal region in the United States. So what exactly constitutes the Mormon formal region? Well, it's basically the entire state of Utah, plus roughly the southern one-half of Idaho, and then parts of neighboring states like Colorado, Arizona, and even Nevada. Now that area is unique in American religious culture for a variety of reasons, and I won't get into any of the details right now, but it does stand apart. It's a part of the United States that tends to have a really high fertility rate. It also has really low rates of smoking, in part because of some of the cultural values associated with that particular branch of Christianity. Let's talk about this yellow region right through here. Maybe perhaps a somewhat weaker example of a formal region. Just because if you look carefully, there's not a whole lot of continuity or contiguousness. And what this means is that it's a somewhat more diffuse formal region. But we'll still call it a formal region. And basically it corresponds to the upper Midwest of the United States. And if you look, in that particular region of the United States, the Lutheran Church is dominant. In fact, Lutherans in the United States are heavily concentrated in just one region, and it shows up pretty well on this map. It basically is the upper Midwest with a focus in Minnesota and especially North Dakota. But, I suppose, including parts of South Dakota and even western Wisconsin as well. The question then becomes, why? Why is this one part of the United States unique? It has to do with immigration. In particular, immigration from the so-called old immigration from the late 19th century, 1880s, 1890s, and maybe carrying on a little bit into the first part of the 20th century. That is the part of the United States that absorbed the majority of immigrants coming from Scandinavia and the northern part of Germany. And they carried their branch of Christianity with them and planted it, quite literally, in the culture of the north central part of the United States. And so that part of the United States, in terms of religion and religious culture, also stands apart. In this case, of course, it has to do with immigration. And oddly, or perhaps not that surprisingly, the same thing is true here. The Mormon Church was founded way over here in New York in the 1830s. But the Mormon community was largely marginalized, prosecuted, and persecuted, and so they eventually kept migrating west and ultimately ended up all the way in the middle part of the American Intermountain West, with a focus in the state of Utah. Finally, a third formal region that is pretty easy to identify is the part of the United States where the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest branch of Christianity. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that is the case, but for now I just want to talk about its geography. You'll notice that it corresponds basically with the American South. So, for example, Virginia is in that formal region, but Pennsylvania is not. It includes northern Florida, but not the southern part of Florida, because the southern part of Florida is a part of Florida that was settled largely by northerners. Also notice that it doesn't include southern Louisiana, and that is because southern Louisiana was brought into the United States a little later on. It was culturally not a part of the South until much later, and it has a long history of French and Spanish colonialism. Both French and Spanish were largely Roman Catholic, and so it's going to behave a little bit differently. So this region of the United States, which we identified previously in our discussion of language, also stands out. It's the American Southeast. It tends to be unique with regard to dialect, but it's also unique with regard to religion. If you're curious what the Southern Baptist Convention means, it basically goes back to the early founding of the United States, when Anabaptists from central parts of Europe came to the U.S., but in the U.S. they changed the regulations. And they made it easier for non-educated people to become pastors and also instrumental in the forming of the church. So it's kind of like a populist form of Christianity. It doesn't necessarily need a learned clergy, which of course is different in terms of the architecture of the religion relative to Roman Catholicism and some of the other branches of Christianity. So in other words, it kind of dovetailed well with Southern culture. Now, what I want to do is just take 3 case studies and we can round out our discussion. This is a better map of the geography of Roman Catholics in the United States, because what it shows us is those places where the Roman Catholic footprint tends to be more substantial, where they constitute a larger share of the population. I want to identify some areas that really stand out. One is southern Louisiana. I'm hoping that all of you know why this is. It has to do with the French colonialism that was instrumental in the shaping of early Louisiana. The French, as opposed to the British, were largely Roman Catholic, and so they brought their religion with them, and that lives on even to this day. What about up here in the Northeast? Why is the Northeast so much more Roman Catholic than, let's say, the Southeast? Well, again, it has to do with immigration. The Northeast absorbed a huge proportion of both the Irish and the Italian immigrants coming in that so-called old immigration wave. Both the Irish and the Italians are largely Roman Catholic, and they brought their Roman Catholicism with them. How about down here along the border with Mexico and into big parts of New Mexico? That has to do with this kind of unique culture of the American borderland with Mexico. This part of the United States was once a part of New Spain. Later on it becomes a part of Mexico. But then after the War of 1848 that we had with Mexico, it became a part of the United States. But the people who live here were largely of Spanish heritage, and they also practice, as you might expect, Roman Catholicism. And what happened then, of course, is that we have a region in the United States that stands apart from the others because of how densely settled the Roman Catholic population tends to be. Finally, I want to talk about Wisconsin. Wisconsin is actually one of the most Roman Catholic states. It is not the most Roman Catholic state, but I believe it's the third or possibly the fourth. And why Wisconsin stands out is again because of the history of immigration. Wisconsin is the second most German state in terms of heritage. It is the most Polish state, and it's also the most Belgian state. The Belgians were largely Roman Catholic and continue to be. The Poles also largely Roman Catholic, and probably about a third of the Germans that left Germany and came to Wisconsin were Roman Catholic. And so immigration is also the reason why Wisconsin kind of stands out. Its unique historical connection to other parts of the world in terms of immigration history make Wisconsin, for example, very different from other Midwestern states like Michigan or Indiana, which, as you can see, are far less Roman Catholic than Wisconsin. I have just two more maps just to kind of round out that discussion of how unique the American South is. You can see here the map of the percent of the population that identifies as Baptists, and you can see it's largely concentrated and corresponds nearly perfectly to the borders of the American South. And I should point out all of the places that were settled by Southerners. So from the East Coast, southern coastal colonial regions, other places like Mississippi and Texas were settled later on by people largely coming from other parts of the South, and they carried their religion with them. Interestingly, you can see this really sharp divide right here, and that's where that southern culture came up against an already existing, largely Spanish-speaking culture that traced their roots back to New Spain. And that's one of the reasons then why that line looks so sharp. Finally, I want to do just one non-Christian example. We could do many, but we'll just do this one. It's an example here that looks at the Jewish population. The geography of the Jewish population has a unique geography. If you look, it's largely in the Northeast, and again, that is a reflection of immigration. Jews who left Ukraine, Russia, Germany, or what have you, during the second half of the 19th century, largely settled in the Northeast. And then later on, as Jews began to climb the economic ladder, they tended to move to places like South Florida, because there's a strong connection between South Florida and the New York metropolitan area. Lots of people go back and forth, they retire there, and so on. And then, of course, there is also a direct tie to large cities. So Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, Houston, they stand out. And that is a reflection of the fact that many of the immigrants to the United States, both in recent times and also to some extent in the past, have settled largely in those big cities. That is our final